Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is May 20th, 2019, and this is podcast number 31. Welcome back to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. I am happy to have you back with us this week. We're going to be talking about rights. Let me give you a heads up. The podcast today is a bit professorial. What I mean is that I sort of talk a little bit faster than usual. I don't know why, but for some reason I started talking, and this is a topic that I really like. I really like to talk about rights because I think rights is the foundation of humanity. If you live in a society where you do not have rights or you do not enjoy anything resembling rights, then you are doomed. You're in trouble. In most societies these days, that's what it is. Although there's the illusion that you have rights, there's the illusion that you have freedom, but in reality, you do not have any of that. So that's why for me, talking about rights is important, because I like to get into the crux of what society is, what life is. And I think you cannot understand the world of man unless you understand what the world of man is about. And the world of man is about control, is about order, it's about the structure. And all of these take away the foundation of human being itself. The human being was designed by nature to be a certain way, to exist a certain way. And when the human being is confounded in a particular place at a particular time within a particular framework, then that person no longer has what I call the right to be. But the way the person evolves in that environment sort of undermines the nature of the individual. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. Rights. What is rights? What is a right? Okay. We have talked about this in previous podcasts, but today we're going to be revisiting this concept a little bit because, the concept of rights is important. As we've talked about in other monologues, the concept of a human right is the foundation of everything humanity has to offer a human being. In other words, you are based on the fact that you are supposed to be. And you are supposed to be based on the fact that you have a natural right to be. And that natural right to be could be understood in several ways. In many cases, this is to say, in many societies, the concept of rights, is relative to an array of things, array of factors, which I will not delve into, which I will not address in this particular podcast. But the concept of rights is so vast in terms of how societies, communities, environments, and places, if you will, have adapted or described this concept to mean a certain thing in a particular concept. But today we're talking about rights in terms of what it is fundamentally. Now, when we're talking about rights, we have to talk about the foundation of the concept. But let us talk about the categories of rights. What could be considered as rights? What are rights in terms of what we as human beings have come to a consensus as to what it is, or what could be inferred from what we understand as being rights? So the concept of rights could be understood from two angles or from two perspectives. The first one is natural rights. The second is social rights. Now, what is natural rights? I've talked about this in the book titled Natural Law, in which I sort of describe the concept of natural rights. But what is natural right is a right that comes from nature. It is not necessarily what philosophers have come to describe as inalienable rights, although they sort of alluded to the concept of natural rights when they're talking about inalienable rights. But their perspective is much more geared towards what I call divine rights. Today I'm not going to talk about divine rights. I'm talking about natural rights. Again, in the book Natural Law, I made that distinction. What we understand as rights to be is often not the case. We sort of confound, or at least we conflate the concept of divine law or divine rights with natural rights. What is natural is not divine. What is natural is natural. Divinity is a construct to some extent, is a human construct. I don't think the animals have a divine understanding of what rights is, or what their rights are within the natural environment. So natural law is what is and what could only be, okay? Divine is what is given by an entity which is divine in nature. In this case, we're talking about God. But to go back to what we're talking about, when we're talking about natural rights, what we're talking about the rights that comes from nature, the rights of being in nature itself. But when we're talking about natural rights, we have to understand that natural rights is divided into two subcategories. There's geographical rights and there is chronological rights, or the rights of time. Now, geographical right could be considered as your place in the universe, your place in the world, your place in the environment where you evolved. Being somewhere in the environment is a natural right, but it is also a geographical right because it is a right that is determined by geography, by location. Let's say that you are a fish, and as a fish, you were designed to be in the ocean. So the ocean could be considered a geographical location, which is a place where you are in relation to other places. And the fact that you are in this particular location, in this particular environment, it gives you a geographical right, and it also gives you a natural right to be there. For example, as a fish, you could only be in the ocean. Whether that ocean is in this location, whether that ocean is in another location, so long as you are in a liquid environment that is natural for you to survive, then you have a natural right to be in that environment. And I call this a geographical right. Same thing. Let us say that you are a bird. As a bird, you get to fly. But getting to fly does not necessarily place you in a position where you don't have a location. Every bird has a location. Every bird has a specific location to be. Even though the bird flies once in a while, at least as a way of life, the bird also has to be somewhere, and usually it's in a tree. So that bird has a location which I call a geographical right. So the bird has a right to be in this particular location. In many cases, it's a tree, top of a mountain, and some places where the bird can exist beyond chance. Okay, and I call that geographical right. So when we're talking about geographical rights, what we're talking about is that we're talking about a natural place where you are supposed to be. As a human being, you are supposed to be on Earth. You are supposed to be roaming on the planet. You're supposed to live in this area. You're supposed to be in that particular location. There are certain parts of the world where it is difficult for human beings to survive. So in those places, I couldn't talk about geographical rights to be there because nature did not design the being to survive in that particular environment. Let's say underwater, for instance. A human being was not designed to be underwater. Therefore, a human being does not have a natural right to be underwater. Same thing in the air. A human being was not designed to live in the air. You don't have anything that allows you to be in the air. Therefore, you do not have a natural right to live or to be in the air. On top of a tree, for instance, a human being was not designed to live on top of a tree. Therefore, the human being does not have a natural right to live on top of a tree. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is that the location where you are supposed to be, you were designed to be in that particular location. That gives you a natural right to be there. When we're talking about chronological right, what I am talking about here is the notion that you are supposed to be in this particular location at that particular time. Okay, the human being or any living entity for that matter is supposed to be anywhere on the planet at a particular time, at a specific time. So your existence is chronological. Your existence is timed. You could never be on this planet beyond a certain time. So long as you were born, your time on this planet is counted, is already determined by your nature. You don't have a right to live 150 years. You do not have a right to live 200 years. So it is not a natural right for you to claim that I'm supposed to live 150 years. So your existence is incumbent upon time itself. So long as you have a timeline as to when you should be, when you are going to be. And this is chronological right. So the understanding is that as long as the person was born, the person has a time stamp on his existence. Okay? You were born today. From that point forward, you are going to exist within a certain amount of time, which is allocated by nature. The human being expires, but the expiration of the human being is relative to time or to nature. Most human beings have a certain amount of time. Of course, there are exceptions to the extent that human beings live longer than others, or some live shorter than others. Nonetheless, it is not a natural right to live a certain amount of time beyond what nature allows. Like I said, a human being could not exist 200 and 400 years. That is from the design of the current human beings. It is impossible. And therefore, you do not have a natural right to exist beyond a certain amount of time, which imposes or which had been imposed by nature. So, to recap, we're talking about natural rights, we're talking about social rights. From a natural standpoint, there are two categories or two subcategories of right. The first one is what we call geographical right, where you have a right to be at a particular location within a certain amount of time. You also have a chronological right. You are supposed to be at a certain location within a certain amount of time. So being on Earth is a right. Every human being has a right to be on Earth. At the same time, that right expires within a certain amount of time, from the day you were born up until a certain point. Of course, we have other factors which sort of undermine those rights, but the foundation of the right to be is relative to those two concepts. You ought to be at a particular place, but you also ought to be there within a specific amount of time. Okay? Now, the other end of the spectrum is what I call social rights. Now, we've talked about social rights, and I'm sure I will continue to talk about that, especially in other podcasts. So when we're talking about social rights, we have to consider two main categories. And the reason I say main categories is because there are other subcategories, which I will not delve into. The two main categories we have to consider is what I call the privilege and power. Okay? Those two categories give you rights. It's either you have power or you have privilege. And they give you rights. Each of which sort of has its own underpinnings. But for today, let's talk about those two. When we're talking about power, okay, what is power? Power is the ability to do or to be and to exist based on power. That power could be a physical power, it could be a mental power, it could be an economic power. Anything that gives you an advantage, anything that provides you an edge over anybody else around you, anything that gives you the capacity to get things, to do things, and to be a certain way is power. Okay? Let us say that you're physically strong, okay? And because you're physically strong, you can impose your rights to be unto others. And that's why it is important to understand that there are subcategories when we're talking about social rights. But for today, let us focus on those two. So the power itself is what gives you the capacity to be. Again, like I said, that power could be physical, it could be mental, it could be economic, it could come from different sources. The understanding here is that you have a right that comes from a power. You have a certain capacity to be, a certain capacity to do, a certain capacity to exist that is based on either sheer brute force, or it is based on coercion, or it is based on something that puts you in a position of advantage in relation to others. So when we're talking about social power, we have to understand that it is relative to others. So you cannot have a social power on your own. There ought to be other entities around you which provide essence to your right. So in the case of power itself, your power has to be relative to others, those who don't have the means that you have. And that gives you an edge over their existence, and that also allows you to live, at least to be, within a certain amount of time in the context of your power. If you have the power to be a certain way, you could impose your existence in a particular location based on that power. Suppose that you are physically strong, and you could decide, you know what, I'm going to exist under that little tree. I'm going to make that tree my home, or my place of being. And nobody can challenge that because you're physically strong. You could take their lives and you could hurt them in such a way that they will not challenge that. Then it becomes your right to be there. It becomes your home, okay? And in doing so, you have a right to be there. But the origin of that right was the fact that you have the power to appropriate that location, okay? It also applies to the concept of time, because so long as you are strong, so long as you're powerful, you're always going to be in that location. You are always going to prevent others from being in that location. So the concept of rights within this framework also applies within the understanding of natural rights. Of course, they're not natural rights, and I don't want you to get confused here. When I'm talking about social rights, and particularly power, I am talking about your capacity to be within an environment in relation to others, and that capacity is based on your sheer brute force, which could be physical, it could be mental, it could be economic, it could come from other sources, but it is not a natural force. It is not a natural power. It is something that derives from something, okay? The other source of rights from a social standpoint is what I call privilege. A privilege usually comes from somebody else's right, okay? First of all, let's define the term privilege. Privilege is when you are afforded the right to be, whether it is the right to exist, whether it is the right to be somewhere, whether it is the right to exist within a certain amount of time. Anytime you are given a right to be, we're talking about a privilege. Anytime the right that you enjoy is not natural, that is to say, you were not born with that right, that is a privilege. Now, privileges usually come from somebody else who has power, or some entity who has power. So in modern society, we talk about government, where we allow government to make decisions on our behalf, and government in turn gives us a privilege to be a certain way. Government gives us a certain privilege to be from a geographical standpoint, from a chronological standpoint as well. But in this case, we are enjoying a privilege, not necessarily a right. Like I said, a right is not inalienable. It is neither given, okay? It is natural. You were born with that right. It cannot be undermined. It cannot be violated. It cannot be taken away. None of that could happen. Anytime there's a right that can be taken away, it is not natural rights. Anytime you have a right that can be violated, that is not natural rights. Anytime you have a right that can be given, it is not natural rights. So the concept of natural rights is natural in terms of it is inherent. You were born with that right, and it cannot be changed. Whenever we're talking about inalienable rights, as if the right could be alienable, or as if the right could be taken away, we are also talking about social rights. And most societies, not most, every society cannot or could not afford a human being natural rights, because natural right cannot be afforded to somebody, cannot be given to somebody, therefore could not be protected, could not be enforced, could not be none of that could happen because it is natural. Like I said, the right to be, the right to exist is natural. So the concept that we need people to give us rights or to protect our rights is a nonsensical concept, because it only applies within the purview of that entity, and therefore it is not a natural right, it is a social right. Therefore that right is ephemeral at its core. So just to recap what we've talked about in this podcast today, the concept of rights has several interpretations, several meanings in terms of where it is understood, how it is understood, and why it is understood. But at the same time, the concept has a natural meaning. And the natural meaning is that a right is something natural. You have it. But when you evolve within a society or within a societal environment, then the right could be relative to the environment itself. But when we're talking about the rights, we have to consider two aspects of it. The first aspect is the natural aspect, and the other is a social aspect. If a right is natural, then it can be a geographical right or a chronological right. What that means is that you can have the right to be a certain way, but you also have the right to be a certain way within a certain amount of time. On the other end of the spectrum, when we're talking about the social rights, we're talking about the power to be and the privilege to be. And if you have the power to be, that power must derive from something, whether it's the sheer brute force of the individual, whether it's the mental power, whether it's the economic power. That right has to come from something that is not necessarily natural. So on the other end, you also have a privilege. A privilege is when somebody who has rights gives you rights, or when some entity who has rights gives you rights. In this case, we're talking about government, or you could also be talking about your parents. When your parents decide when you go to bed, when you eat, when you go out and whatnot, your parents sort of give you privileges. The same thing when the government tells you when to drive, how to drive, where to be, how to be, when to be, how to behave, and whatnot, then the government gives you privilege. Those are not rights. A right is something natural, which cannot be given, which cannot be taken away, which could never be violated to some extent. So based on that understanding, when we're talking about rights, the fundamental of the concept is that it has to be natural. It has to come from nature. If it doesn't come from nature, it is a privilege, or it is a social right. Therefore it is ephemeris. Therefore it could be taken away. Therefore it must be enforced. Therefore it must be protected. Therefore it must be enforced. So those are not natural rights. Okay, so natural rights are natural rights. So they are the rights of the natural. They are the rights to be. They are the rights to exist. They are the rights to find oneself in a particular place at a particular time on this place called Earth. Therefore, those rights are not inalienable to the extent that they could be taken away. They are not inalienable to the extent that they could be violated. They are not inalienable to the extent that somebody ought to enforce them. An entity ought to provide such rights. So they are the laws of nature, and every living entity enjoys such rights, including human beings.